Jonathan. Christmas program practice. Way too early for that. Within my own mind. It's great to be back in the pulpit this morning. Great to be here. Turn, if you will, in your Bibles to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. Before we actually look at the text, I want you to give thought to something. And this is the topic this morning is not particularly on marriage, though the application will have some points of application there, just as we grow in Christ-likeness. But I want you to think for a moment of what is the best and what was the worst marital counseling you received. For those of you that are married, I want you to look back and think for a moment about what was the best and what was the worst marital counseling that you ever received. I love right now actually to open it up and to get input. Time's not going to allow that. What I have found in a lot of contemporary weddings that I do, that the bride and the groom will actually put a book out, or they will actually have within the bulletin words that individuals are supposed to write and say, this is what I would suggest, this is the advice I would give, this is what I do, or this is what I wouldn't do. And I am just nosy enough and just curious enough that many times once the reception is going on, I'm not a real big wedding reception person, so while everyone's down eating their cookies and cake, etc., I'll go up and actually grab the book and look through it. Because I'm fascinated by what people say. I mean, some of it is just high level of philosophical, thoughtful, relational, intellectual input, like don't change the direction of toilet paper. Apparently, there are those that within the context of their marriage, they struggle with whether it ought to go over or whether it ought to go under. I am not sure why anyone would ever put it under. It always is supposed to go over. But beside that, I'm not sure how valuable that is to particular marital instruction. Words like this, never tell him he's wrong. Words like this, always tell her she's right because she is. Compliment him every day. Make sure that she knows that she is loved. That has some validity to it. And then there are obviously a series of other things that are said, some of greater value than others along the way. When my wife and I met, and I won't tell the totality of this story, but we had 3 dates. And after those 3 dates, then I actually moved to India, and I lived in India for a year, and came back, and after I landed, I asked her to marry me 3 days later. So we had the totality of 3 dates, followed by a year of significant geographical separation. We had 2 phone calls in that period of time, and then I asked her to marry me pretty much right when I got off the plane and could drive to the location she was in. So by and large, we actually got married without knowing one another. Our dates, particularly the first 2, were in essence, and we still joke about it today, they in essence were job interviews. And it wasn't a matter of job, it was just, all right, where are your values, where are you going in life, what's important to you? And at the end of those 2 dates, we determined that what was important to us and what our values were lined up. In other words, we were going in the same direction and we were going the same speed. The only thing that was left to answer was, could we actually enjoy going together in the same direction and at the same speed? So the 3rd date, and these 3 dates took place in a period of 10 days, because I was on my way to India and didn't have a lot of time. And so the 3rd date, into the 2nd date, I actually looked at her and I said, I know this is bold and you certainly have the right to say no, but would you like to go out on the 3rd date? She said, yeah, I'd be willing to do that. And I said, great, I'll pick you up at 4 a.m. And I did. She asked one question, what should I wear? Good question. And I said, be prepared for anything. And she was. And so she was living in North Carolina, I was living in South Carolina at the time. We took a 3-hour drive down to Charleston, South Carolina, and we spent from 4 a.m. all the way to midnight together. It was a 20-hour date. And on that date in Charleston, South Carolina, we did everything together that I could possibly think of. We ate street food, we ate nice food, we went to art galleries, we rode horseback, we were in carriages together, we walked the beach, we rode bikes, everything I could think of. And at the end of the day, we got back in the car, and as we were driving back, I simply said within my own heart, Lord, if I could enjoy a full day with her, I can enjoy the rest of my life. I'm good to go at that point. So I actually called my parents and I said, make sure you set up some vacation time next year. When I get back from India, I'm going to marry this girl. Well, it's been 31 years now, and we have thoroughly enjoyed most of it. Not all of it. Life is life. And we've had to learn. And what we've had to learn is, because of the time frame that we've spent, we had one 30-minute premarital counseling session. And in that one 30-minute premarital counseling session, I was asked one question. And it's actually that question I'd like to speak on today. And the question is simply this: how dirty is your towel? How dirty is your towel? Okay, now, we need to put that in context. John 13, let's bring everything together from a gospel perspective. Christ obviously is getting to the end of his life. When we look at the Gospel of John is not the shortest by way of words within all the Gospels, but certainly the shortest as it relates to describing the totality of Christ's life. The Gospel of John contains 21 chapters, and in essence, it covers a little less than 3 weeks of Jesus' life. That's all. So that when John gets to the end of the gospel and he says, now, the heavens themselves could not contain all that Jesus did, there's a certain sense in which that's obviously a figure of speech, but there's also a sense in which that's just very true from John's perspective. He's taken 21 chapters to communicate 3 weeks, and he spent 3+ years with Christ. And he's saying, now, there's a whole lot more that could be said. The bulk of John's gospel actually focuses on the last about 48 hours of Christ's life. By the time we get to John chapter 12, Jesus is already in Jerusalem. He's already entering into the last week. And so John, if I can phrase it this way, is running toward the cross. And everything that he includes, particularly in this last week then, is of utmost importance. He's highlighting these final moments because in the final moments of Christ's life, he wants to make sure that future disciples grasp who Jesus is. In that setting, John 13 is told to us. We often define this as the Last Supper. And indeed, it is from a timing perspective. They go into the upper room. But before the celebration of the Last Supper, this event takes place. Many of you are familiar with it. Let's begin our reading in verse 1. So it says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them unto the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he was come from God and was going back to God. All right, let me just stop our reading for a moment there. This is actually where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, and we're actually going to work through the passage backwards. All right, so we're going to start at the end and then work backwards. What I want you to note about these first 3 verses is that nothing is taking place by way of action. The first 3 verses give us a divine perspective of what Jesus was thinking. This is one of these sections of scriptures that we really should embrace. Because starting in verse 4, you're going to have a series of verbs that take place. All right, and Jesus is going to rise, and lots of action is going to take place. But the action doesn't take place until the attitude is formed. Okay, so the attitude that we see in the first 3 verses are going to be absolutely foundational. I want us to note that before we get to the more familiar section of the passage. The more familiar section of the passage is the action itself, verse 4. Jesus rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand, but afterwards you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you will have no share, no part with me." And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need washed except for his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not every one of you, for he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, 'Not all of you are clean.'" Now, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done." And we'll stop our reading there for a moment. All right, let's set the scene, and then we'll look at really the importance or the essence of what Jesus did. The action will really come in setting the scene, and then we'll look back at the attitudes, just so we know where we are as far as the text is concerned. All right, what's happening? Christ and his disciples, with Judas obviously included, we know that via verse 3, is going up into the upper room. All right, another time I could make the argument that the upper room is probably in the house of Mary, the mother of Mark. All right, so larger house, they go up into the room, it's already prepared for the Passover feast. And as they go into the room, we know what the disciples are talking about before they ever get there. All right, we're actually told that in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Luke. Do you remember what the disciples are talking about? Who's greatest in the kingdom? So as they're making their way up, all right, in their mind, there is resonating the cheers from all of the individuals of Jerusalem that are saying, "Hosanna, Hosanna, here's the King of the Jews." And they are the ones that have faithfully followed him for the last 3 years. Christ is about ready to take the throne. Messianic promises are about ready to be established. The kingdom is going to be set up. And they are thinking to themselves, "And what role do I have?" Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Treasury. Mothers have already gotten the ears of Jesus and said, "Hey, can my boy sit on your right until you're on your left?" And these guys are very aware of this. So as they're going into the upper room, they walk in and there is a table. Now what we need to do is we need to take Da Vinci's picture out of our mind for a moment. All right, Da Vinci his picture is not portraying accurately what was happening in this particular scene. Ancient Near Eastern tables would have been about 18 inches high. So they would have been down about this high. And everyone would have laid down and leaned on their right elbow. They would have eaten with their left hand. And in essence, it would have been a round table. And all of the individuals leaning on their elbows with their feet going out. So think in terms of like a great pinwheel. That's what it would have looked like. Which is actually going to be important because later in the passage it's going to say that the disciple whom Jesus loved was leaning against his breast. Well, that would make sense because John would have been to the inside of Christ. And as they're leaning on their elbows, John would have just leaned back and grabbed Christ's ear and said, "Who is it that's going to betray you?" All right, so that's the scene. Always walking into, and I'll put this both within a contemporary context and then an ancient Near Eastern context. There are particular states in the Union that when you walk into a home, you take your shoes off. The majority of those, I've lived in both the North and the South, the majority of those are actually in the North. So when you go into homes in Wisconsin and Minnesota, 2 states that I've lived in, it's very typical, whether you're an inhabitant of the home or a guest, you take your shoes off and you walk in. South, not so much. Culturally, a little bit different there. Well, ancient Near East, the very first thing you would have done when you walked in is there would have been a servant that would have been at the door. You would take your sandals off, you would wash the dust off, and then you would go and you would sit down. Well, the disciples, in their haste to sit down and to enjoy the Passover, and in the midst of their conversation about who's going to be greatest, they just make their way to the table. No one addresses the basin that is already at the door. It's prepared for action. Christ sits at the table, and ultimately, verse 4, he rises from the table, takes off his outer garment, takes the towel that would have been beside the basin, takes the basin of water, and again, all the boys' feet would have been outside, and he starts with the first one, and you can just imagine what's going to happen here. All right, two things. One, let's deal with Peter's frustration with this. All right, Peter, when he gets to Peter, Peter says, "Don't wash my feet." Now that sounds like a really strong statement. But Peter would have been aware, as all the disciples would have been aware, of the status of a foot washer. We know via the writings of the rabbis that there actually was a law case that had taken place about 30 years before the time of Christ. And the law case was simply this: a very well-known Pharisee, actually the father of Gamaliel, the one who ultimately taught Paul, was well established in the scriptures, and he came home one day, and as he was coming home, he walked into his home, and with great fanfare, his mother actually sat down with a basin of water and attempted to wash his feet. And Gamaliel's father said, "Far be it from you, the mother of a great rabbi, to wash feet. That's way below your status. You're not allowed to do it." And Gamaliel's mother looked at it, or Gamaliel's grandmother looked at it and said, "Oh, no. I want the privilege of washing the feet of my son, who's this great rabbi." Well, as the Jewish law would have it, those two actually went to court. And the law case was simply this: is who has the appropriate status to wash feet and who doesn't? And the mother lost. No Jew was to wash the foot of another Jew below their status. So when we get to Peter's protest, please understand, this is not just Peter being Peter. Sometimes we read it that way. This is Peter actually understanding Jewish law and saying, "Rabbi, it's not right for you to wash feet." Put that in context. And then Jesus begins to wash the feet. And quite honestly, this is a scene that I hope that there were angels in heaven that with big video cameras recording this. Because when I get to heaven, I want to watch this on DVD. I have a series of questions. Question number one is, how long did it take for the room to grow silent? Because Jesus would have gotten to the first disciple, feet outstretched, and began to wash his feet, really from the ankle down. And no doubt the disciples were still going back and forth on who was going to be greatest. And then did it take him to the second disciple, or to the third disciple, or to the fourth disciple, until finally someone realized actually what was taking place, and the room grew silent? I'd like to know that. Second thing I'd like to know is, what was the interaction between Jesus and Judas? At what point did Jesus look at Judas? And at what point did Judas look at Jesus? We know that there's engagement later on in chapter 13. Ultimately, Judas is going to rise up, and Christ is going to say, what you do, go. Just go. Do it quickly. Judas's heart, we know verse 2, Satan had already put into his heart to betray him. And Christ knows that. But he still washes his feet in the process. That's the action. The action is of Jesus Christ taking on the lowliest form of a servant and getting his towel dirty. Why does he do it? Well, go to the end of the passage. The essence of why he did it was this: that a dirty towel represents ultimate Christ-likeness. A dirty towel represents ultimate Christ-likeness. Jesus rises and he simply says, now what I did as an example for you, that you would do it also. All right, what does that dirty towel represent? That dirty towel represents the essence of why Jesus Christ came to earth. Mark chapter 10. I did not come to be served, but to do what? To serve and give my life a ransom for many. And that phrase there, to serve, all right, if we want to know what that looks like is the next phrase. To give my life, in Christ's context, a ransom for many, which ultimately meant the cross. And so a dirty towel pointed to a bloody cross. And that's what Christ is driving at. He's looking at his disciples, fully aware of the fact that the kingdom is not going to be established, but he's about ready to leave, John chapter 14, and that their responsibility here on earth is to represent him. And they would not be representing him on thrones. They would be representing him with towels in their hands, washing the feet of others. So let's set the setting. We know what's happening as far as the action is concerned. But the importance of this passage is simply this. Let me go back to premarital counseling. When that individual asked me, and when really what he communicated to me, he said, the essence of you being a godly, Christ-like husband is that you will have a dirty towel. You will be one who is consistently serving your wife. Always. You will be consistently serving those that are around you. You will be consistently serving those who you minister to. You will be consistently serving those that are within your community. And then he simply said this, the person with the dirtiest towel at the end wins. Now, the winning there certainly is not in terms of what we would define as winning. The winning there is simply the person with the dirtiest towel comes closest to acting like Christ and looking like Christ. Okay, so this is the setting. All right. Why is this chapter important? Well, it's important because Christ has said, you do this to reflect me. And if we're here this morning with a desire to reflect Christ, then we need to pay attention. All right, that's why it's important. 2, what does it look like? What it looks like is serving the people that are around you in the most meaningless or small task, menial task, in whatever way necessary, so that you are serving them. All right, now let's get back to the beginning of the passage. And as I said, how in the world is this accomplished? Because so many times when we talk about servant leadership and we talk about dirtying our towel, our natural focus tends to be something like this. Well, yeah, I'll be a servant leader, and if that means that I need to clean the bathroom for a weekend, I can do that. If that means that I need to vacuum something when other people can't do that, I can do that. And so what we tend to do is we tend to take servant leadership and actually minimize it to small actions. And I'll simply say a servant leader isn't about what you do, it's about who you are. And what Christ is described for us in these first 3 verses. I've already noted that in the first 3 verses, the Holy Spirit gives John, through inspiration, insight into the very mind and into the very heart of Christ. And there's actually 3 phrases here that tell you what Christ was thinking. And these 3 phrases are going to describe the attitude of a servant leader, the essence, the internal essence. Let's look at what they are. Verse 1 again. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew. Okay, actually each one of these could actually be, it's a participle, so it could be ing. Jesus knowing that his hour had come to depart out of the world to the Father, having loved or loving his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And then going down to verse 3, Jesus, knowing that his Father had given all things into his hand, that he was come from God and was going back to God. So Jesus is thinking, as he is sitting there at the table, he's thinking about three realities. And those three realities prompt him to rise and to wash the disciples' feet. And let's look at what they are. The first one is simply this. Jesus is aware of the fact that he has limited time. Jesus is aware of the fact that he has limited time. All right, he simply begins by saying this. He knew that his hour had come. And what was that hour? That was going to be an hour where he was going to depart. He was leaving. When someone recognizes internally that they have limited time, it motivates action. Not only does it motivate actions, but it actually shapes priorities at that point. Right, some of you, like me, I'll speak to those that we have some similarities here. All right, some of you, like me, have white hair, gray hair, or less hair. All right, and I'll put all those in the same category because we all understand what that means. And what that has done for us, and certainly I put it within my context. I own who I am without any hesitation. All right? I'm 61. By God's grace, that I hope to be in active ministry for another 10 years. God's given good health, good energy, and I hope to be in active ministry for another 10 years. You know what that means? That means that every year that goes by, 10% of my ministry investment is gone. 10%. That's a lot. But when I started, in 20, I'm thinking 20 to 70, I've got 50 years. All right, so that means that each year of my life is just 2%. All right, so I got a lot more to go. I've got a lot more to go. But boy, when you get to a particular age, you begin to reprioritize what's important in your life. I think now in terms of, again, by God's grace, Sherry and I will be together for another 30 years, maybe 40. Who knows? But I know this. It's a lot less now than it was when we started 30 plus years ago. And there are certain things that I've always wanted to do for my wife. That early in marriage, life was just busy. Life was full. Yeah, I didn't have time to, I'll get to that. Well, the getting to that suddenly becomes much more real when you see the clock ticking. A servant leader is one who recognizes, if I can phrase it this way, that the clock is always ticking and ticking far faster than your towel can handle. It's a mindset that says that I have a limited amount of time to be with and to serve these individuals. Because there's a recognition. Christ knew he was going to his Father. And he had literally less than 24 hours with them. But a servant leader is one who is looking at the clock and saying, I have this amount of time to love my wife. I have this amount of time to love my children. I have this amount of time to love my grandchildren. I have this amount of time to function within the context of my workplace and within my neighborhood, and to do the things that I know are necessary to reflect adequate and full Christ-likeness. So a servant leader is one, from an attitude perspective, they hear the ticking of the clock within their hearts. And the ticking of the clock doesn't discourage them. The ticking of the clock actually motivates them. And again, the sooner, I'm not suggesting that one wait until they have white hair to hear the clock. The sooner one does that, the more opportunities they have to get their towel dirty, and the greater level of Christ-likeness is displayed within the totality of their life. All right, so the first attitude that Christ has is he recognizes that he has limited time. And that limited time has to be used for acts of service in others. Second
attitude that he has. Picking it up in verse 2, simply says this: having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them unto the end. He had limited time, but he had limitless love. He had limitless love. It's really interesting, that little phrase, depending upon the translation that you're looking at, it can be translated in different ways. Some of your translations might say this: he loved them unto the end. Some might say he loved them unto the uttermost. And so commentators will try and quantify that. Are we talking about Christ's love until the end of time? Is it a matter of quantity, or is it a matter of quality? That he loved them to the uttermost. And of course the answer is what? Well, yes. Christ loved them until the end of time, and he loved them with the highest level of quality. Christ was one who recognized that love was absolutely necessary for servant leadership. You serve because you love. Now, what's really important to understand is that love is not reciprocated, or let me phrase it this way, that to be a servant leader, one doesn't have to depend upon the reciprocation of love. Turn back with me just quickly to Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. In Luke chapter 17, there's this little parable that if we're not careful, we'll misunderstand it. And we certainly can misapply it. In Luke 17, Christ is speaking of what true servanthood looks like, and he says this: will any of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he's come into his field, come at once and recline at the table? Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me and dress properly and serve while I eat and drink, and afterwards you will eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you have commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. All right, if we read that particular parable and misapply it, we can be highly ungrateful individuals. The parable is simple. If you're the one who has the servant, and you're lounging and someone is feeding you grapes and they're fanning you in the heat of the ancient Midwestern day, all right, when the servant comes in, are you going to look at the servant and say, hey, you know what? You've been out in the sun for the last 10 hours, taking care of my crops. I tell you what, why don't you take a 30-minute break, run into the room. As a matter of fact, don't go into your room, go into my room. Go into my room, get a shower, cool yourself off a little bit, and then when you're ready, go ahead and fix me dinner. That'd be great. And then after we have dinner, we can sit down and we can eat together and we'll have dinner together. And by the way, I want you to know that all through the course of the day, I've been thinking of you, and I've been so thankful for the work that you've put in on my behalf. All right, is that the way that a servant is treated from Christ's perspective? No. He says, the servant works all day in the hot sun. When he comes in, he doesn't have a moment to stop and to cool himself. He has a responsibility, and the responsibility is to go fix dinner. And then he goes and he fixes dinner, and then he serves the master. And after he's done serving the master, is he going to wait around and wait for a thank you? Of course he's not going to wait for a thank you. At the end of the day, all he's going to say is this, I'm a servant. And because I'm a servant, I'm unworthy as a servant. A servant who has limitless love is not a servant that is demanding and needing consistent affirmation. Now, the parable obviously is not teaching that we should not express gratitude. Right? That's not the point. The point is simply this, is when you are a servant, you serve. And you expect nothing in return. That's what true service does. Now, certainly, we should reciprocate with love and with gratitude. But that's two individuals serving one another. If the individual that you are serving is not serving you, should that stop you from serving? And the answer, of course, is no. And that is what allows Christ to grab Judas's feet. And as he's grabbing Judas's feet, he washes them with love and he wipes them with care, knowing that there's absolutely no reciprocation whatsoever. And not only is there no positive reciprocation, there's actually going to be a betrayal that will take place in 12 hours. And what does Christ do? He keeps serving, and he keeps serving. Loving someone includes loving your enemy, or someone at that point which you deem your enemy. Have you ever been in a context like that? I was in a workplace where the individual, I was a particular supervisor, and I had an individual who worked underneath me, and this individual, I think their primary goal in life was just to make me miserable. And his particular task was one that he controlled data that was necessary for good decisions within the organization. And so I needed the data. So I would go into his office and I would ask him, hey, can you get this report for me? Can you get that report? That would be really helpful if we could get that. And he would just smile. He'd say, well, kind of busy today. Not sure if I'm going to be able to get to that. And this went on not just for days, but it went on for weeks and it went on for months. And everything within me, as I thought about washing his feet, the way that I envisioned it was simply my taking his toes and just starting to pull them apart from one another. All right, have you ever I'll wash your feet. Bring it on. All right, and you just want to grab them and you just want to squeeze a little bit and you just want to start pulling them a little bit, and until you see the tear. Yeah, is this good? I'll wash your feet, and your hands start to shake a little bit, and you're just like, yeah, this is. Limitless love means that I serve my enemy 24/7, 365. Without any level of reciprocation and affirmation. And at the end of the day, I simply go before my God and I say, I'm an unworthy servant. And my responsibility is merely to reflect you in this relationship. Whether that's a relationship that's within the home, whether that's a relationship within the workplace, whether that's a relationship within the community, what sets us apart is the way that we love. And the urgency in which we do it, because we know that our time is limited. Then there's a third characteristic, going back to John chapter 13. Not only is Christ motivated by a limited amount of time and an unlimited amount of love, but he also has unlimited resources. And I love this. Look in verse 3. Jesus knowing, again, before he ever gets up, he's thinking one more thing. Jesus knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was coming from God and was going back to God. So the very last thing he thinks about before he gets up is this recognition. I have everything. And I'm going to go be with my Father. Stop for a moment again, if you'll allow me, just a very mundane illustration. There was actually, not that long ago, if you remember, within the context of the news, there was a lot of chatter about the size of the particular, I think it was, I don't play lottery, but whatever the big number is where you win lots and lots and lots of money. And this was one of the biggest pots that was available, and so I heard about it on the news, and I told my wife, I said, honey, this is our chance. I mean, this is our chance. Just think, what would we do if we won? And Sherry said, so what would you do if you won? And so we were having this fun conversation about winning the lottery, walking across the campus at Faith Baptist Bible College. Can you imagine what would happen? I mean, students would, all of a sudden they would catch up with me. Hey, Mr. Trainer. Kate, congratulations. Not asking anything, but just want you to pray about this. I have a school bill right now. And my school bill is a little bit more, and I might not be able to come back next semester. And my school bills are around $3,000. I'm not asking for anything, but if you would consider it. Listen, if I would have won, I don't know how big the number was, $500 million, whatever it was, to give that student $3,000, that's nothing. That's just nothing. I throw my money into a basic money market, and I make that in, half an hour. $3,000, I'd love to give you $3,000. Next student, $5,000, not a problem. Here's $5,000. See, the reality is this, is when you have everything, to give something means nothing. You have the joy of giving it away. What Christ is doing is simply this. He's stopping in, he's looking at his life, and he's saying this, I'm about ready to go to my Father, and the Father has given me everything. My identity in him is totally secure. The riches of his grace pour out of my life. I lack nothing. And since I lack nothing, I can give something to anyone that asks for it. I can serve, and I can serve freely because I have all of the grace and I have all of the capacity to be able to give to others. Now, that's certainly not, in our context, a monetary issue, but it's a service issue. Can I serve my children? Can I serve my grandchildren? Can I serve my spouse? Can I serve my coworkers? If I have everything in Christ, if I lack nothing, I can give them something by way of service. The question in my 30 minutes of premarital counseling was simply this: how dirty is your towel? How dirty is your towel? The individual with the dirtiest towel finishes first. The individual with the dirtiest towel reflects Christ. The individual with the dirtiest towel looks for every opportunity within their context to serve those that are around them. The individual with the dirtiest towel is the one who understands that they have limited time, but they have unlimited love, and they have absolutely unlimited resources in Christ. So they go through life with a desire to serve everyone that's around them. I trust this morning that your towel's dirty. And I trust this morning that through the course of today and that through the course of this week, that you continue to dirty your towel. And may that be a mark of Walnut Park. And may that be a mark of us as individual believers. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness. And we will simply ask, it's a very simple truth. But you take a simple truth and you prioritize it by modeling it within the last moments of your life. Lord, so within the context of our homes today, within the context of our lives this week, may we look for opportunities to display Christ-likeness by washing the feet of others and doing it with joy. Even those who at times are less than friendly to us. Lord, may we recognize that your love through us can impact and can change our heart. And we'll give you thanks in your name.